Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final day of the annual Arbitration and ADR conference hosted by ourselves here at ICC in the United Kingdom. My name is Chris Southworth. I'm the Secretary General of ICC here in the UK, and I'm delighted to introduce this panel, which has been close to my heart for a long time, actually, during my time in ICC, around our nominations committee, subcommittee, I should say, which supports the Arbitration and ADR committee here in the UK. So just before I invite our moderator, Riaz, Hussain, and the panel to come and speak, I thought I'd just explain a little bit to some of you who don't know how we work with the court as a national committee within ICC. This is the same pretty much for every national committee across ICC. And what we sort of handle in terms of cases when it comes to the court. So first of all, the majority of cases are handled directly between the parties, the companies, and the court itself. The lion's share, 90% plus cases are handled directly in that way. What the nominations committee's role is in the 5 to 10% of cases where parties can't agree on an arbitrator and the court needs some help to go and look for an arbitrator, usually with a very specific set of skills and experience, which will be explained by the panel shortly. They then come to the national committees, in this case, ICC United Kingdom, to ask for help to have a look at the network and our database of UK arbitrators or UK-based arbitrators to find the person who's right for that specific case. But the main point here is this is a small minority of cases, and they're generally the ones that are the most difficult in the sense that there's a very tight criteria in what the parties are specifically asking for. So I'm delighted to invite Riaz Hussain KC. If I could ask you to come up on the screen and with your panel, and hopefully as an audience, you will now have a full run through on all the tricky tasks that this committee have to do. They do a terrific job, I have to say. It's a very, very important role in ICC overall, and the UK committee is particularly well regarded in ICC as a network and at the court in terms of the quality of the arbitrators that they put forward. And of course, diversity is always top of the mind to try and ensure that everybody gets the experience and the opportunities that are there for them. So Riaz, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to introduce the other panelists in a moment. I thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit about the kind of the role of the nominations committee. I was invited to be on the committee about 2 years ago now, and before that I had no idea about the existence or role of the committee. So I think it's useful to kind of give some information. The best information is a note on the ICC website. It's called the Note to ICC National Committees and Groups on the Proposal of Arbitrators. And I encourage people to look at that to understand what the nominations committee is about. But just going through some of the key points in that note. Firstly, pursuant to the ICC rules, the ICC court may, when appointing an arbitrator, seek a proposal from a committee or a group. It's important to know that such proposals are not binding in nature, and the ICC court retains a full discretion regarding who they actually appoint. That being said, the ICC operates by encouraging national groups, including the UK, to form a committee or a nominations commission. That's to ensure fairness and transparency. The members of the nominating committee at any given time are on the ICC website, so you're able to see who they are, and they are encouraged to be replaced after every 3 years, again to ensure fairness and transparency. We're not allowed to nominate ourselves or the members of the committee, nor are we allowed to require that anyone we propose be somehow a member of the ICC or a member of any body. So that's a kind of general point to remember. The other important point from that note in the rules is that the court will generally not appoint the same arbitrator more than once in 12 months. There's some exceptions for emergency arbitration and so on. So that's also a good way to keep a wider range of arbitrators going. We are going to talk more about the actual process of proposing arbitrators, but the note contains a checklist of items that the committee should have regard to when proposing an arbitrator for a particular case, and that these include obviously the facts of that case, the legal system involved, and also the language, the amount of dispute, the obvious things. But we are specifically asked to bear in mind trying to uphold diversity in appointments in terms of gender, ethnicity, and so on. And we'll talk about that in a moment. As Chris said, we deal with a minority of cases. So looking at the last set of data from November 21 to November 22, there were about 18 requests to the committee to make proposals. I mean, that can go up and down in a given year, but it's not a huge amount of proposals that we make in any given year. We try and maintain data on who we're proposing, with some limitations that we'll talk about, I'm sure, later on. And in terms of the kind of work that we are asked to, or the areas of expertise that we are asked to appoint on, these include a sizable amount of those cases include construction cases, unsurprisingly, general commercial cases, sale of goods, and then we'll have the variety of cases that are unexpected. With that introduction, I just want to say one more thing. Everyone will see a Q&A tab on their screen. So I encourage people, if they have questions, to not await the end of the talk, but to start posting them as we go along, and we'll try and pick them up. I just want to now introduce the other panelists. If we can just start with Ashleigh Brocchieri, who is actually here from the ICC court. Ashleigh, if you can talk about the role of the court and how you interface with the committee, and then I'll call on the actual committee members to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much. So, hello everyone, my name's Ashleigh Brocchieri. I am expert counsel at the Secretariat of the ICC court. I've been with the ICC for about 11 years now in various roles, including previously in the case management team that dealt with the cases coming out of the common law, which included the UK, Ireland, and English-speaking Africa. So I'm just going to, as a nice general introduction to what we're talking about today, explain to you how you can enter an ICC arbitration as an arbitrator. So there are two routes to becoming an arbitrator in ICC arbitration. The first one is by party nomination. And I think Chris mentioned at the beginning, this is the largest pool of arbitrators that actually come to us. So last year, 60% of all arbitrators in ICC arbitrations came through party nomination. 16% on top of those came through nominations from the co-arbitrators that the parties had designated to choose a president. So that's 76% of all cases the court has no involvement with. Now, I say no involvement, limited involvement in confirming the arbitrator in case of disagreement between the parties as to the actual candidate, if there's a conflict of interest that's been disclosed and the court needs to make a decision. But the largest pool do not come from the ICC court itself, it's from parties. And so as we're going through this, your speakers are going to give you lots of great advice as to how to improve your profiles through the National Committee, but also do have in mind that most of these do come from the parties, and so you do need to market yourselves on a wider scale than what we're talking about today. The second way to come in to be an arbitrator in ICC arbitration is through court appointments, and these represent about 25% of arbitrators in ICC. Through the court appointment, then there are two ways to come in, two sub-process I would call. One is through the proposal of national committees, and one is through a direct appointment to the court. So the court decides to directly appoint an arbitrator in limited situations. And that's where there's a state or state entity involved in the arbitration. If the court wants to invite an arbitrator from a country that doesn't have a national committee itself, or where there are special circumstances in the case that means that the president certifies that a national committee appointment wouldn't be appropriate and it's more appropriate to have a direct appointment. That these are cases where either the pool of arbitrators is so small that we don't think we'll be able to go to a national committee and find an arbitrator from that nationality, or if a national committee is temporarily suspended or not working for whatever reason. So the most interesting thing we're going to talk about today is, of course, the national committee route. So how does the court choose an arbitrator through a national committee? Well, this is a two-step process. The first step, the court would decide to designate a national committee and invite them to make a proposal. So the Secretariat would submit the matter to the ICC court and inform the court of the nationalities of the parties, the location of the counsel, the nationality and location of any co-arbitrators who have been confirmed by the court on the party nomination, the place of arbitration, the applicable law, the language, it's a very important one, and any other criteria relating to the case. On the basis of that information, the court would then designate one or more national committees where it thinks the national committee has a pool of arbitrators where to choose from. And so if, for example, we have a case where the place of arbitration is London, it's English law applicable, the law is language, it's very likely that the court would designate the ICC UK National Committee to make a proposal, as long as we don't have only one party from that jurisdiction, because there are rules about having arbitrators who are not the same nationality as the parties. And so then the Secretariat writes to the National Committee, we give them information about the case, so the procedural aspects that I've just listed, and also a brief description of what the dispute's about. The National Committee then go and do absolute magic to go and find the right people for the right case. Once they've done that, there may be a discussion with the Secretariat just to define more details of the case, get a little bit of extra information, and in the end, send us the proposal. The Secretariat then submits that proposal to the court, and the court decides whether or not to accept it and to appoint that arbitrator. Sometimes a national committee will propose more than one arbitrator, or if it's a specific case, the court may have written to more than one national committee to have a wider pool of candidates. And in that case, the court will make an analysis of the 2 or 3 candidates that are being proposed and choose one of them and then appoint that person. Just before we move on to the rest, I just wanted to give you some statistics as to some of our rankings. I think you may find it interesting. So in terms of arbitrators generally appointed and confirmed, so in the whole process, either by parties or arbitrators, UK arbitrators rank by far as the #1 most popular choice. So in 2022, 189 UK nationals were appointed as arbitrator, which represented 15% of all arbitrators in ICC arbitration. To put that in context, the second most popular choice were Brazilian arbitrators, where there were 126, which represented only about 10%. Put that into more context, the next common law jurisdiction after the UK was the USA, who had 91% of arbitrators, which represented just 7%. So if you put that 7% compared to 15. And I think even more interesting, if you then compare that to the number of UK parties in the cases, the difference is even more extreme, because we know that even the non-UK parties are choosing UK arbitrators or UK-based arbitrators for their choice, even if that's not their own jurisdiction. Okay. Thanks, Riaz.
Thanks very much, Ashleigh. It was very flattering to hear the last bit. I wasn't aware of that, but it's good to see that we're doing really well. Just on the Q&A, someone's asked, does the committee inform the candidate before making a proposal? Yes. I mean, we will normally discuss with a court who we're thinking of approaching, just to make sure that they're on the right lines. And then it's actually the candidate who then does a conflict check, fills out the forms. We'll be talking about that a little more later. But yet the candidate is very much involved in the proposal. It's not something that's done without their cooperation. I just wanted to use this time now to we're lucky enough to have some members of the committee with us. Just trying to think of the best way to do this online. But if we can just have Paul, Philippa, Gaurav, and Angeline, I think we can deal with you all being on screen at the same time. If you can just introduce yourselves and kind of your main areas of practice.
Should we go in that order, Riaz?
Yes.
So I'm Paul Stothard. I'm a partner at Norton Rose Fulbright in London, and I am a commercial arbitration specialist, although I have also a background in investment arbitration. I have recently moved back from the Middle East, where I've lived for 10 of the last 20 years, interspersed with spells also in Beijing and Tokyo. And so I add a little bit of I suppose, international flavour in relation to the network I have for those jurisdictions, because quite a few of the inquiries we get, albeit they are to the UK National Committee, may concern matters of, for instance, UAE law or seated in other jurisdictions. So, and very often some of them have a requirement to have arbitrators based in those seats. Often because of the value of the dispute or the applicable law. And so my contribution is often to reach out to those people in non-UK jurisdictions, but where there is a preference to have the nomination made by this committee. So I continue to lead the Middle East disputes practice for the firm, and I specialise in a whole array of commercial arbitration, energy, and infrastructure and financial institutions most commonly. And I'm just going to say briefly, because I think this is going to be a running theme, how I got my first appointment as arbitrator. I was a newly minted partner. I was 31 years old, and I happened to be sitting next to the General Secretary of a regional arbitration centre in one of the jurisdictions that I've just mentioned. And he happened to mention that they were looking to refresh the list of arbitrators they had within that institution. And I said, well, I'd be delighted to put my name forward. And within a week, I had received my first appointment, and I was exceptionally proud of myself at such a young age. And I told everybody I knew, but what I didn't tell them was that it concerned a fitted kitchen in a posh apartment. The fees were less than $1,000. And the kitchen was worth about $30,000. And I think it probably took me a year working effectively for free to resolve the dispute. But it was a great experience.
Excellent, Paul. And that is a remarkable achievement, actually, 31 years of age. That's fantastic. Philippa.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Philippa Charles, and I'm now a full-time arbitrator at 20 Essex Chambers in London. Until January this year, I was working in private practice as the head of arbitration for Stewart's in London. And after 10 years there and previously 15 years at Mayor Brown in London, I decided to move full-time into the arbitration space. I think my experience as arbitrator started probably when I was a bit older than Paul, which is, I'm really jealous now. But I did get my first appointment before I was 40, and that came from the LCIA. In fact, I was appointed as a co-arbitrator in a case where the parties had not made their own nominations, and that kind of got me off the mark. I think my first ICC appointment followed maybe a year later. As a sole arbitrator, and certainly those early cases tended to be sort of lower value potentially, but deeply interesting, and often the lowest value cases I think are actually the most complicated. In many ways, they often throw up some of the most complicated issues. But in my practice now, as a full-time arbitrator, I'm sitting under the Singapore rules, the Finnish rules. I have a number of ICC cases and LCIA cases, and it's it's proved a great departure for me personally. But I would say by the time I came to move into full-time arbitrating, I had probably done 20 appointments already, and perhaps that's something to emphasize just in terms of those who are interested in developing that as a full-time career, that it's really important to get time on the board before you take the risk of moving into the full-time arbitration space.
Thank you, Philippa. Angeline?
Thanks, Riaz. I am a barrister at Essex Court Chambers in London, and my counsel arbitration practice deals with a broad range of commercial disputes and investment treaty disputes. And I also sit as arbitrator on a reasonably regular basis. And my first appointment, I think, probably did come through the ICC UK Nominations Committee. In fact, and probably it was done by someone who I knew from appearing in cases, I think, opposite them, and was looking for someone. I think I used to be at a law firm, and I moved to independent practice, and that does sometimes make nominations easier from a conflicts perspective, and I think that's where it came from. And I'm pretty sure it was a sole arbitrator appointment, and I'm pretty sure that I didn't get paid very much for a complex dispute, but it also, I think, was really important because it was the starting block of many appointments to come. So I'm remaining incredibly grateful for it.
Thank you, Angeline. And Gaurav?
Good morning, everyone. I am a barrister at Quadrant Chambers in London. I wasn't always a barrister, though. I have been in-house for a while. I used to work at Shell as an in-house litigator for a number of years. And before that, I've also worked at arbitration firms, Three Crowns and Dev Boys and Plimpton over the years. So covered the range there. My particular sort of specialization tends to be in energy matters, and I try and that's the domain that I tend to work in. That has actually, strangely enough, led to a lot of conflicts arising when I've been approached for appointments over the years. But I'm happy to be able to say that I have been able to take an appointment in a completely different field, which I'll tell everybody about in a couple of years' time. But it's to do with endangered species. So I'm looking forward to reporting back on that in a couple of years. Hopefully, it will be well paid, but I'm not sure that it will be. We'll see.
Awesome. I think I just need to plug our arbitrator and ADR database. So if you, I think a link for it is being posted on the chat, and you can find it quite easily if you go UK ICC arbitrator database. That's a good way to kind of be on the horizon of the committee, because it allows you to set out your specialisms, the languages that you speak, and so on and so forth. We'll also be talking about how the committee is trying, with some success, I would say, to diversify the pool of arbitrators. We'll be talking about first-time arbitrators and also the importance of a range of arbitrators in terms of gender and ethnicity, age, and other characteristics. So we will be talking about that as we go. So you'll see that there's a wide range of experience in the nominations committee. The ICC actually requires that anyone on the committee be someone experienced in ICC arbitration, whether as counsel or as an arbitrator. So each of the members brings with them a good working knowledge of the industry and what a particular dispute requires. And then obviously, as you've seen, each of them has a particular specialism within their broader experience. Gaurav is kind of our go-to guy for oil and gas work. No pressure, Gaurav. So that's a really kind of useful resource that we have. Now, one of the first things that we have to do when we approach someone is make sure that they do a conflict check, and they have to actually sign a declaration of impartiality and independence. And that's something that we wanted to share some information about. Angeline, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the approach to conflicts?
Sure. Thanks so much, Riaz. So I thought it's quite helpful just to explain the internal processes that we go through, because conflicts is always one of the major issues when it comes to appointments, which I'm sure none of you will be surprised to hear. So the information, when we get a request to make an appointment, the information that we get from the ICC includes a statement, a sort of case summary, which is very helpful. And what that does is it obviously identifies who the parties are, but it also identifies who the counsel is for each of the respective parties, which is obviously critical information when it comes to checking conflicts, and also identifies oftentimes related entities. And so that I'll come back to in a moment, but this case summary information is one of the things that we will provide to prospective arbitrators when we're asking them to clear conflicts for the purposes of an appointment or recommendation for an appointment. And as Riaz says, and many of you will have seen from probably your own practices, an prospective arbitrator has to sign a statement of independence and impartiality and availability. So they will need to look at this information and satisfy themselves that whether they need to make any disclosures or not. And then it's that fill in the statement of independence, partiality, and it's that document which we provide to the ICC. One of the issues which there's a few issues which arise practically speaking. One is sometimes a question of timing. So we will need to, particularly if we're appointing solicitors from firms, we'll need to approach a solicitor, and they will normally use this information in order to conduct their own firm-wide conflict checks. And one of the things that I think is probably quite helpful to point out is that in the related entity section, as I understand, the way in which that is compiled by the ICC is going through the papers which have been submitted by the parties to date at that particular point. So it may well be, I mean, sometimes we get hardly any related entities, but sometimes we get quite extensive list of related entities. And it's just a flag that actually some of those related entities may be of a greater or lesser connection to the dispute. So it's one of those issues where I think if you get a related entity and you think, oh, there's potential conflict there, that's something which is worth coming back and discussing with us, and we can raise with the ICC to see whether or not that is something which, or is an entity which is so connected to the dispute it would throw up a disclosure issue or not. So that's something which I think is worth bearing in mind if you are ever approached. The other issue that I think is worth just flagging potentially is the amendment which has been proposed to the English Arbitration Act, to the extent that this is what you're being asked to be appointed on is an English-seated arbitration, which is not obviously always the case, but may be relevant in other contexts, because there is a question as to what extent someone who's approached for appointment or an arbitrator ought to make their own inquiries as to whether or not there is a conflict issue. So as you probably know, under the English Act, the proposal is to bring in an obligation on an arbitrator to say that they're under a duty to disclose what they actually know, and probably more relevantly, what they ought reasonably to know. There is obviously the IBA guidelines, which have also a sort of duty on arbitrators to make reasonable inquiries. And those rules are being looked at, or amendments to them are being looked at in the moment. And one of the sort of broader obligations which is being considered is whether parties will be under an obligation to identify all group entities and more. So I think that's something which I think is to just watch that space, because in future there will be a question as to what is the extent of that reasonably to know obligation in terms of what inquiries an arbitrator ought to make. And I think if you're in a law firm, then you're obviously reasonably set up to deal with that, because there will be your own internal business acceptance unit standards. But independent practitioners probably need to think a bit more carefully than perhaps they did previously, in my view, as to what sort of questions they ought to ask the parties. And that's why, and that's particularly related, I think, to this related entities point, which I just flagged. The final thing I think to say just on this is that in the past, certainly my experience is that sometimes if you have extensive disclosures, and we sometimes propose more than one candidate to the ICC for appointment, the ICC may be more inclined to take an arbitrator who has no disclosures, or certainly less disclosures. And that's, I don't think, I mean, actually, we spoke about this, there's no policy, I think, that if you have you make a disclosure, the ICC is not going to appoint you. But because it's an institutional appointment, it seems that understandably that the cleaner the sort of disclosure section, the better in terms of getting an appointment. But obviously, just because that's the case, it doesn't necessarily, that obviously doesn't undermine any duty of disclosure and to make reasonable inquiries. So if you have a disclosure to make, you have a disclosure to make. And there will also be some cases where actually it's just impossible to find an arbitrator who doesn't have a disclosure to make. But I think it's fair to say that obviously the cleaner the sheet, as a matter of fact, if that's the way it turns out to be, the easier it will be to get the appointment made. That's all I was going to say, Riaz, unless anyone has any questions they want to ask about that.
That's really helpful. Angeline, I just encourage people to put questions on the Q&A. Philippa, do you have any insight into, obviously as someone who's headed a firm and is also now an independent practitioner on top of your work for the committee, do you have any particular insight for how to deal with conflicts or disclosures?
Yeah, I think, Angeline's beautifully summarised the approach that one ought to take. And I think the internal approach, if you like, is always, if in doubt, make a disclosure, because as much as the circumstance may be completely harmless, I think it's much more important that issues are aired early than that they come out later in the course of the process. And I think as a practitioner, one can always look at something and say, well, if I were to find this out about somebody else in the course of the proceedings, would it make me feel uncomfortable? And if the answer to that is yes, then I think it's important to make that disclosure. But as Angeline's mentioned, if it's a question particularly around the sort of extended list of parties where there may be a relationship that's problematic or would be problematic if they were a key player in the dispute, then it's always worth just coming back to the committee and enabling us to kind of close the loop with the ICC so that we can either provide some reassurance or clarify that actually it is going to be a problem in the longer term. I mean, our focus, certainly in terms of younger or less experienced arbitrators getting off the mark, we've talked quite a bit about our drive for diverse candidates and so on. And I think it's harder, especially for people who are working in big multinational firms, to produce a clean sheet. And we very much appreciate that, but it doesn't stop us approaching those people. And what I would say is that as long as you have the support internally to take on an appointment, and that can also be an issue for people working in private practice, because obviously it requires a time commitment and it attracts a fee, which is not the same as would be the case for your work in private practice. But as long as you have that backing, then there's no reason not to proceed and not to put your name in the ring for this kind of appointment and experience. So I think whilst it's really important to be as upfront as possible about any potential conflict, as Angeline says, we will try and take forward new candidates or less experienced candidates to give them the experience and to promote a diverse range of candidates where we can. And the disclosure by itself is not necessarily the end of the world.
No, that's a really good point. I think one of the things I quite like is that when we approach people to be proposed, there is a clear fee range, so people can take an informed decision as to kind of whether it's worth their time or not. Moving on from conflicts, Paul, there's already the question about how the process works and when candidates are approached. Do you want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of a typical nomination and the kind of pressures that we face or the criteria that we have?
Yeah, by all means. So we are, as a committee, provided with papers concerning any given case. Riaz will distribute those papers as the chairman to one of us to take the matter forward, we may discuss between ourselves, having reviewed the papers, who is the best person to take that particular one forward. I think just to add to what Angeline said, each of us is required to undertake our own conflict check at that point, which is of course essential to make sure that none of our firms or chambers or none of us are involved in the matter, and that itself causes some delay, particularly if it's a firm, you know, like mine, with an international dimension, and it can take several days for that to be cleared, which adds to the time pressure, because often these appointments need to be made quite quickly. And so, you know, Riaz will email us on a Friday evening after my conflicts people have gone home, and I will scramble around trying to make sure that it's done over the weekend, and then we can start the job of finding candidates the following week. So in terms of the information we're provided with, the ICC helpfully provides us with a case summary. We don't see the pleadings, but we are given a neutral summary of the dispute. It will involve, as you've heard, details of who the counsel is, if counsel's been appointed, other critical details such as the value, the governing law, the seat. We're given details of the arbitration clause itself. If the arbitration clause provides for criteria for the arbitrator nominee, then of course we take that into account. We have seen some very specific criteria for candidates over the years. I think recently we had, I think, was it someone who had been in the film industry, perhaps even, I can't remember precisely what the formulation was, but a film star, I think, was that the criteria he has recently, which caused a lot of...
I think it was has experience as ICC arbitration, and also I think, Gaurav, you had to do that.
Yeah,
one.
I think it was 10 years experience in the motion picture industry.
Yes, and
on top of ICC experience, yeah, that's.
And I think to Gaurav's credit, we did actually manage to track down a candidate who was appointed on that particular matter. So well done. I mean, normally it will be more plain vanilla, you know, experience of certain types of disputes, experience of some governing law, located in a particular place. I mean, it should be borne in mind that some of the inquiries that come to the committee are for low value ICC arbitration, relatively low value. And so in those cases, we may be asked to find a candidate who is located in a certain place so that the fees are commensurate to, you know, ensure that the matter is disposed of efficiently. So, I mean, those are some examples of the kind of criteria that will go into us making and here's my dog, making the decision. Someone should have been taken for a walk an hour ago, so apologies for that. The other factor that comes into consideration is, of course, experience and whether it's appropriate to consider appointing somebody who is a first-time nominee. That will also often be a function of the value of the dispute, and we do specifically receive requests from time to time to consider first-time appointees, and that's something that has occurred recently. I think probably with greater regularity, actually, my perception over the last couple of years, more so this year than in previous periods. Having been provided with that information, we approach candidates. My typical approach will be to email candidates that we have identified in the first instance, and then have a conversation just in order to see whether that particular candidate is interested in taking the role. In my experience, I find that almost everybody that we approach is interested, subject to conflicts, even in disputes which you may feel are not going to be particularly remunerative. Most people are prepared to consider appointments. The other thing I've noticed, again relevant to first-time appointments, is there's an awful lot of people out there who you may assume have a vast experience of sitting as arbitrator, but who haven't. I think people who are looking for first-time appointments should take a great deal of assurance from that. Some people appear as counsel all the time, but just haven't sat as arbitrator or haven't wanted to, even quite senior figures. And I've approached people confident that they will have a CV a mile long, but they've asked our advice about taking their first appointments. So you just can't tell. So we will typically make an appointment within, I would say, a week of being asked. Often we are required to seek an extension. We're given a deadline, but often we do have to seek an extension because of conflict issues. And that's particularly the case if there's been delay in us carrying out our conflict checks and then the candidate themselves having to carry out conflict checks as well. But 7 days, I think, is a credible timeline. So I think those are the mechanics, and we make our nomination, and often we have approached more than one candidate. We are candid with the candidates about that. So if you are approached by us and you are not appointed, that is not because of any particular factor that we will be able to identify. It is normally because the more than one candidate has been approached, and sometimes it's the case that more than one commission has been approached as well. So there might be inquiries going on through different commissions as well. So yeah, so I think that's probably amongst all my distractions at this end, all I've got to say about that, Riaz.
Thanks very much, Paul. I think normally the court will request more than one candidate, no matter how strong the candidate is, and we're very upfront that we are putting forward a proposal of a person amongst other people. So that's useful to know. I'm going to go to Gaurav in a second about first time appointing people who haven't sat as arbitrators before, but I thought it'd be good to kind of just catch up on the Q&A box. I think, Ashleigh, there's a couple for you. The first one is question is whether as a non-UK, non-EU national, someone is able to practice or register with the ICC as an independent arbitrator. I think just from my end, as an unofficial person, you don't need to register with the ICC to be appointed as an arbitrator. I think the question might be who would be the kind of particular nominating committee that would be appropriate to you. There are cases where we are asked to nominate someone regardless of their nationality, or sometimes actually even asked to appoint a non-UK national. So it really will depend on the particular case. But Ashleigh, any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly. So the first one is the ICC does not have an official list of arbitrators. We don't keep you are an ICC arbitrator list. When we need to appoint someone, we look out at the entire world. And anyone in theory is able to become an ICC arbitrator as long as you have the qualifications. In terms of which national committees you could be appointed through if you are either a dual national or you do not reside in the country of your nationality. So our national committees can generally nominate anyone who's of their nationality. So the UK National Committee can nominate UK nationals wherever they're based in the world, or the National Committee can propose someone who is resident in their country. So the UK National Committee could nominate non-UK nationals, whether or not they're European, as long as they are resident in the UK, and then, of course, as long as they have the necessary qualifications for the particular case.
Thanks, Ashleigh. And then on the question from Katia Finkel, she's asked, that some arbitrators adopt a very general approach to disclosure, saying that over the years they've worked with both sides' counsel. Just quick views on that. Maybe, Ashleigh, from you. This is, I think, specific to the counsel rather than the parties or related parties.
Yeah, it might help here just to clarify a little bit how the court deals with disclosures. So normally when a nomination comes through a national committee, or if the court's looking at a direct appointment, if there are no disclosures, the parties are not informed of who the candidate is in advance to be able to make comment. It's the court will appoint the person and then you find out who it's going to be. The exception to this is if the court is considering appointing a candidate who has a de minimis disclosure, in which case we then circulate the forms to the parties in advance for any comments before the court makes a decision whether or not to appoint the arbitrator. And this comes back to the point that I think Angeline made at the beginning. Having a disclosure does not blacklist you or cut you out in any way from being appointed. But in terms of timing, if the court's presented with two candidates of equal experience and one has a disclosure and one doesn't, the one with the disclosure would have to circulate to the parties, whereas the one with the non-disclosure, the court could just appoint, which is obviously much more efficient. And so going back to the actual question, this disclosure, we wouldn't ask the arbitrator themselves to provide any additional information for if the candidate was proposed by the parties. If it was proposed by a national committee, we would want a little bit more information to be able to decide if that disclosure was in fact de minimis. And even if we decided to circulate that disclosure to the parties in advance, the parties also have the opportunity to come back and ask questions, whether it's through a party nomination or a national committee or a potential direct appointment by the court. As a party, you can always write and ask the arbitrator to provide further information if you're not satisfied that that disclosure gives you the information you need as a counsel to make a reasoned decision as to whether or not to object to that candidate.
Thank you, Ashley. Just the last question is about language. I'm just not sure I'm understanding the question completely, but the question is, would you need to be familiar enough with the language to write an award in it? I think the answer would be yes, if that's the language of the arbitration. The question may have a different slant, which is that sometimes we get an English language arbitration, but the governing law is French law. So the Secretariat will be clear, or the court will be clear to us that they need someone who has a good understanding of French law. I don't, but I'm guessing that to have a good understanding of French law, you could work off a translation, but it'd be helpful to have some command of the French language, but you would still write the award in English. So I think that's the short answer. Gaurav, do you want to talk a bit about the cases where the court tells us that previous experience as an ICC arbitrator is not necessary for an appointment? So typically they'll require that experience as ICC counsel is sufficient. Do you want to talk about kind of nominations, those cases, just to inform everyone? Those are like the ones that make us really happy because it's a good chance for us to get in a first-time arbitrator and widen that pool. So we get very excited about those. Gaurav, do you want to talk about your experience of those nominations?
Yeah, it links up to this question, which is, which we all get asked, I think, on the committee by people of various, with lots of experience or with not so much experience. How do I get appointed? And it's exactly those sorts of cases where the requirements don't say you have to have sat as a sole arbitrator or a sole arbitrator in an ICC case or in an ICC case at all, but you must have acted or you must have appeared as counsel in an ICC arbitration before, and that's good. And we need to be quite open about the requirements here. On any occasion that the ICC court is looking to appoint an arbitrator for a case, then the most important thing is that appointee has the requisite experience and quality to sit as an arbitrator in that case, because at the end of the day, that's precisely the service that the ICC provides. It's to resolve disputes and be paid to resolve disputes for parties that have chosen to resolve their disputes by the ICC or ICC arbitration. So that's got to be the key criteria here. And when it comes to demonstrating quality and experience, we on the committee, we have experience in the arbitration world, and we have networks and professional networks that of arbitrators and counsel that we know, but we also make inquiries through our networks, through each other. We listen to each other. Paul might know people in Beijing or in the Middle East or in a particular industry. Philippa may have sat with a number of arbitrators, same with Angeline, same with Riaz as well. So we draw on each other's experience and networks, professional networks, to try to understand exactly who has seen the sorts of candidates in action, frankly, as counsel in their cases, so that we can be confident that the people that we're approaching have got that most important thing, the quality that they bring to the cases. And that doesn't matter if they're, junior associates or if they're partners. As Paul said earlier, it's surprising the number of sort of heads of arbitration of firms that you approach that you think have probably sat 30 or 40 times and have actually never been able to take an appointment for whatever reason, often because of conflicts. So they focused on their counsel work and they're looking for first-time appointments themselves. So you end up with this great pool of people who are ready now, we would say, to take appointments, who've got lots of counsel experience but have never sat before. So it's really wonderful when we get a chance to do that. But we also look at more junior members when that's a possibility as well. They could be associates at law firms, they could be junior barristers, whatever it happens to be, who are looking to lay the groundwork maybe in a couple of years' time. And as Paul said, there are often those cases that might be expedited cases where there's a need to appoint somebody on a low value case, perhaps, where it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to have somebody who's sat before, sat lots of times, but to get new arbitrators in who have a track record of working on ICC arbitrations. And so that's who we look to appoint. So, the most important thing I can say when you are looking to place yourself or position yourself for those cases is to do them, to work on as many cases as you can, so that you build up that professional network of people that we can draw on, who will vouch for you at the end of the day and say, well, this person I think is ready to sit. You can also write books, write chapters, write articles. That helps. It gives us some visibility on what you're doing. Again, it's not quite as good as, or as important, I would say, as appearing as counsel. But it's another opportunity for us to look at the pool of candidates out there. Now, when it comes to experience, of course, it's the same sort of thing. It's through the body of cases that you work on that you build up the reflexes and the instincts to deal with the various things that come up in the course of the arbitrations, the ICC arbitrations that you will want to sit as an arbitrator in. So you may have more routine things like seeing the variety of ways that tribunals deal with procedural timetabling, written submissions, pleadings, memorials, evidence, the timing of those things, how they should be structured in the procedure, dealing with interim applications. Again, hearing from both sides, being able to deal with them quickly, how to deal with them, orders, awards, getting those instincts by doing the cases. But also, so you can deal with the more unusual situations as well. Things where you're dealing with privileged evidence or a respondent who hasn't appeared. I don't know how unusual that is, in fact, but you need to know how to deal with that and how to deal with it with care. So actually seeing that done can be very valuable. And, another way to do that is, or an additional way I would say to do that is to sit as the secretary to an arbitral tribunal, especially if you're probably at the more junior end of your career, and that's a suitable thing to do. It's very valuable. It gives you a unique perspective, a non-partisan perspective, where you can start to try to guess what the things are, what those decisions are that tribunals have to make, and to try to work it through yourself before you actually see what the ultimate decision is, also to feed into that decision-making process. So I never did that, but I think I would have found it very useful if I had. Now that I'm sitting, it's quite helpful to have, I would imagine, to have actually seen it and had a dry run at it before you're actually called to do it yourself. So as you said, Riaz, I think it's our eyes light up when those cases come up and the case information doesn't say you have to have sat as an arbitrator before. There are cases where that happens. I think my impression is that we're getting more people appointed as first-time appointees on the cases that we're getting. I think there's openness to that. The onus is still on us to make sure that the people we're putting forward are excellent candidates and meet the quality and experience criteria. But as you said, we have been able to do it. And maybe this answers or responds to one of the questions that was asked a minute ago about languages, etc. Sometimes it's those specific attributes that are quite valuable, especially when you're a more junior practitioner. So if you speak a particular language, or you have knowledge of a particular system of law, or you're based in a particular jurisdiction, those stars can align and put you in a very small pool of arbitrators who are actually appropriate for a case. Funnily enough, in the motion picture industry case we were talking about a few minutes ago, the person that we appointed had been a child actor in cases. So that was the sort of genesis of of their experience when it came to the motion picture requirement. And the biggest pushback we got was that they were dual national. They were a UK national, but also a US national. So that had to go to the court for a decision, and to the parties first to see if they had any objections to it. They didn't, and the court made the appointment. But it just goes to show, it's an even smaller pool of people sometimes that are available for particular cases. So, what I would say, the final thing I would say is make sure you put that on your website. If there are particular, nationality is not a bad thing to put on your website, especially if it's not that obvious, because we need to know when the criteria comes to us. And also a particular background experience that you have. It's good for us to know and to be able to see that in advance so that we know who to approach.
Thanks, Gaurav. Just conscious of time, I'm going to pass on to Chris. Just one quick question, whether you need to have a legal background. No, you don't. We often are asked specifically to appoint someone with engineering or other kind of technical experience. So please put yourself on the database. Don't feel shy if you're not a lawyer. Chris, just passing on to you, mate.
Oh, that gives me hope, yeah. Well, look, massive thank you to Riaz and our great panel of speakers. This is such an interesting area. So if you do have any further questions or you'd like more information, you should have received our arbitration@iccwbo.uk email, and you'll get through to Erica in the team, who will be happy to provide support. Please don't forget the arbitrator database. It's a really, really important tool, both to promote diversity, bring as many people into the opportunities as we possibly can. And please always remember that these guys have the hardest job of all. So their ability to influence is much less than the companies themselves. We promote that database to all the companies, the clients, the parties, as well as the committee and everybody else. Just like to say, if you've got any good case studies as well of examples, there's been a few given by the panel today where you've actually won a case and something that you've done that's helped do that, whether it's through the database or the committee or the network in general, please do let us know. Send it into the email, and we'd be more than happy to promote that. So it's good for everybody to learn. So massive thank you to the panel. Thank you to our sponsors. Most of all, thank you to the audience. The next session is on the all-important Arbitration Act reform, and that kicks off at 12 o'clock UK time. I was going to say British Standard Time, but I'm not quite sure if it's that or Greenwich Mean Time. Now I'm confused. It's UK time. Keep it simple. Thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to seeing you in an hour's time. Thank you.